Spring has sprung here in Portland, Maine, and as promised, I am going to take a little trip out to Evergreen Cemetery, which is about 5 minutes drive, probably that away. It is where the bodies of quite a number of people who were important in Matthew's life are buried. I didn't know that when I moved into this attic apartment, but I found it out after being here about a year or so. But first, I'm going to describe Matthew's own description of the cemetery when it was in the planning stages. He submitted this to the Portland Transcript, May 15, 1852 edition. I'm going to read from the original. He signed it with his star or single asterisk, which was his go-to secret signature. Here is the edition. I have just a cardboard cover wrapped around the outside because it didn't have a cover. So he writes, Evergreen Cemetery. We have heard the above name suggested for the new city cemetery at Stevens Plains, and I think it not inappropriate. The area, which comprises between 50 and 60 acres, being covered with woods mostly of an evergreen growth, pines, spruces, silver firs, etc. The lot is a most eligible one, I don't know what that means, for a rural burial place, the soil being of the proper quality, and the tall, dark woods being already interspersed with paths long since made by woodcutters or traced by the cattle, winding hither and thither in such a manner as will make it difficult for the city to improve upon, excepting so far as relates to properly turnpiking them up. We know of no place in our vicinity so suitable for the purpose intended, and inasmuch as it must hereafter be the chief burial place of the city, we hope that the city authorities, in fencing it and laying it out, will be governed by an enlarged and liberal policy. The passageway to it is only 55 feet wide on the street. Let a handsome gateway of freestone or granite with iron gates be built here, one that will readily, by its architectural proportions and finish, point out the place to the passerby. Let the main grounds be tastefully laid out and substantially fenced, and there are few so poor in our city as would make them unwilling to give $10 or $12 for a choice of its lots. Thus a sinking fund might be raised, which in the end would pay the whole expense of the place, and in less time, we are prone to believe, than its projectors have an idea of, numerous snowy monuments would be seen shooting up among the gray shafts which sustain the Gothic arches of verdure overhead, and the heart-stricken and thoughtful would love its dreamy aisles. The Westbrook Cemetery immediately adjoining, having been already extensively used for burial, will make our people turn their attention the more readily to the locality as a place of sepulture. The location is about 2.5 miles from the heart of the city and may be reached by 3 different roads, each of which is a pleasant walk or drive, and signed with his star. Now, where I am right now is actually what used to be Westbrook. It's about 2 miles from Portland. I can look out my window that way and see the skyline of Portland, at least in the winter I can, when the tree isn't full of leaves. And the cemetery he's talking about is now on Stevens Avenue. It used to be called, apparently, Stevens Plains, and it is, in fact, a flat section. So what I'm going to do is to go out there, probably on several successive days. I'm going to wear the same old shirt here, which I see I didn't button one of the buttons. I'll do that now. And I might have to have a jacket, or who knows, but I'll make it look as though, you know, it's the same day, but really speaking, it won't be. So you might see a little differences in the weather and so on. Maybe some flowers will suddenly start sprouting out or whatever. That's because it took me about a week to complete. But my plan is to sit in front of each gravestone with my cell phone camera video and read from original sources like this Portland Transcript, but things that relate to each particular person and Matthew. I have several ideas lined up, and I'll just kind of put these things in the car, make sure it's a good day. I won't go out on a rainy day, and carefully, read from these original sources, and that might be kind of interesting. So we are now going to head on out to the cemetery. Here we are at the entrance to Evergreen Cemetery. I'd say it's not quite the way that Matthew envisioned it, but it's still attractive. So now we're going to hop in my Kia Soul, which happens to be alien green, and we're going to proceed to the first gravesite. Here we are at the Patton plot. Patton is the married name of Abby's oldest sister, Elizabeth Poyen. She became Elizabeth Patton, and her tombstone is here. You can get a sense of what this is like. Over here is something that looks like a rather modern Christmas present, which is how I find it. Now we're going to walk, if I can, with the phone. I'm not used to using phones for video. And we will see if we can zoom right on in on Elizabeth's name. Here is Stephen Patton, her husband. And let's see, here we are, Elizabeth Patton and Stephen Patton. And then over here is Abby's niece, Susan Maria Patton. And I will show you a picture of her. She has a very interesting history because, for my study, because it so happens that she had a picture taken, or a picture was taken of her the day before she died. I would guess she had consumption. It's possible that she caught it from Abby even. It takes a while to develop. She was a beautiful young woman. And look at the courage and the faith, the rock-solid faith in those eyes. Magnificent person. One thing that's particularly interesting about her is that she looked very, very similar to Abby. One guesses, based on the picture of Elizabeth, that she took after Abby's father, the French side. So this is one way I know that the unidentified miniature portrait of Abby, which was painted by Matthew's first cousin, Ruth Whittier Shute, is in fact of Abby, and that is because of this very strong family resemblance to Susan Maria. Now, what I'm going to read from is the essayist, which is, here we're going to be in 1833, and this is a poem signed A.P. I can put it up on the screen, but here we go. Actually, I don't think I'm going to put things up on the screen. I like the idea better of just reading from the original sources and so on. This is no doubt claimed by Albert Pike, as he claimed all of her other poems. But it was not Albert Pike. It was Abby Poyen. And E.P., if he didn't change the initials, I'm going to have to hold this thing. E.P., if he didn't change the initials, is probably Elizabeth Patton, or Elizabeth Poyen if she wasn't married by this time. I'd have to check. So apparently this was written, if I'm correct, it was written around 1828 when Abby was somewhat younger. And when she was about 12 years old, she went through a period of being shunned. And I think it was because she was tricked into giving a palm reading for some local girls, because she mentions a scenario like this in her one of her stories. So apparently everybody judged her, except, and in particular, her oldest sister Elizabeth, who was probably like a mother figure to her, and Matthew. So she wrote one of these poems, I believe, to Matthew, and I think that Albert Pike changed the initials to somebody he knew, and one to Elizabeth. Now, as far as the particulars about why I think this is Abby and why I think it's not Albert Pike, I think he was a rather sociopathic character. I don't think that he had a terrible conscience. I don't think he had done anything that he was particularly ashamed of. It's not a match for him, but it's a perfect match for Abby about 4 or 5 years earlier. So what happened was, apparently, that when she took Albert Pike's class in Newburyport in 1830, he stole a bunch of material out of her workbook, including private poems, and this is one of them. So I'm going to read it. To E.P. How sinks the sad and lonely heart amid the world's dim wilderness, when not an eye with friendship's art gleams like the day star's silver dart, his somber path of life to bless? How sinks the heart when not a tone of friendship breathes upon its blight, when mid the world it seems alone, like a sad star which once hath shone but sunk with a sunless night? So sets the star, but if there glide another star in quietly, to shine in splendor by its side, like some sweet, tender, loving bride, the night is like a sunlit sea. And so, whene'er I think on thee, upon thy love, thy faithfulness, though hid in guilt and misery, each other thought a torment be, that one doth never cease to bless. So I believe that Abby wrote that to Elizabeth. This is Charles Isley's stone. This is the main marker, not his actual stone. Charles Parker Isley. He was the editor of the Portland Transcript in its first years, which Matthew contributed to quite a bit. He began contributing to this, as near as I can tell, in late 1838 when he and Abby moved to Portland, Maine. And over here we have his actual stone. This guy was very retiring. He believed in keeping a low profile, very much the way that Matthew did. So this is what we've got of Charles Parker Isley. He was an excellent writer, especially stories, short stories, and as well as an editor. He also apparently was a pretty advanced amateur cryptographer, which came in handy when analyzing Edgar Allan Poe's coded poem, which I talk about in my upcoming paper. There's only one painting of him, supposedly, but it's been lost, so we don't know what Charles looked like. I'd love to find out. But I'm going to set up here, and we're going to read a story of his that was published on the front page of the Portland Transcript, the back of which I've already read because it had Matthew's star-signed essay concerning the beauties of nature. These shooting conditions are very tricky because the lighting is going to be extremely unflattering. I can see that already. I'm going to have to hold this with one hand and stay in the shot. So this may be a little awkward in terms of the technical aspects, but this is the Saturday, October 5, 1839 edition of the Portland Transcript. And above this story called The Boar's Back is a poem about on passing a graveyard. This is by someone named L. I'm certain it's not Matthew. It's not, we don't know who it is. It's lost to time, just like the graveyards. But I'm going to read it because it's rather apropos. So I'm trying to keep Charles's stone in the picture. It's not easy. Hopefully the wind won't destroy the audio here. So this is called On Passing a Graveyard. Hush, lo, the dead, their lowly bed in yonder consecrated ground. Calm is the sleep where willows weep, and silent spirits hover round. No impious jest or thoughts molest the solemn whisper stealing o'er us, that we must lie as low as they, who are gone but little while before us. These glens and rills, these groves and hills, their power no less to please will keep. When we shall die, nor earth nor sky have charms to wake us from our sleep. Yet shall the mind no pleasures find when forced to quit this brittle covering? The soul shall rise above the skies, round heaven's high throne with angels hovering. A brighter clime of scenes sublime shall be its everlasting home, where sorrow smart, an aching heart, and death can never, never come. So you see the consciousness they had of death and of transcendence in this era. We've lost so much. This is called The Boar's Back. Obviously, I'm just going to read a little bit, just get into it, give you a flavor of it, by Charles P. Isley. And he has a quote, "For do but stand upon the foaming shore, the chiding billows seem to belt the clouds, the wind-shaked surge with high and monstrous mane, seemed to cast water on the burning bear and quench the guards of the ever-fixed pole. I never did like molestation view on the enchafed flood. And another quote, a wreck complete she rolled at mercy of the waves, whose mercies are like human beings during civil war. Okay, so let's see if we can keep him in the frame here a little bit. I think more or less I have it. There we go. What scene so grand, so thrillingly imposing as the sea during a storm, the great waves hurrying to the shore, piling up ridges of foam along its rocky barriers, and causing the very foundations of the earth to tremble as with fear, as the watery mountains are hurled in quick succession against her boundaries with the voice of many thunders. We who live by its side, with its hoarse giant voice ever in our ears, little heed these glorious manifestations of its tremendous power. But let him to whom the scene is unfamiliar stand upon our coast, with the broad Atlantic, a world of waters stretched out before him. Let him for the first time behold the sleeping giant aroused in wrath. Let him hear deep calling unto deep, and see, quote, the giant waves like mountains lift their white tops to the sky, and a sense of awe of his own puny insignificance will steal over him, and he will stand rebuked and silent in the presence of that power which threatens to set at naught the almighty fiat. Thus far shalt thou go, and no farther. From our childhood we have loved the sea. In storm or in calm we have always found it alike a wonder and delight. We have long been accustomed, and we reckon it not among the least of our pleasures, when the wing of the tempest flaps over the deep, to stand upon the threshold of the ocean and witness the elemental strife. In our frequent rambles to a particular spot, we have formed the acquaintance of an aged fisherman, whose neat dwelling affords a comfortable retreat when our fervor has become cooled by the drenching spray and the searching sea wind. Now I could go on, but this is a bit uncomfortable and I'm having wind problems. So I think I'll stop. But you can see how beautiful his prose was. It's almost like poetry. His prose is like poetry. He was a magnificent writer. So anyway, that is Charles Parker Isley, and may we someday find an image of him. We are now approaching the stone of the Portland barber of Matthew's era. This is John M. Todd, born 1821. Had a little trouble finding his stone, but here it is. And he's here with his wife, Frances. I don't have any particular memories of him, but we have a nice little anecdote in his autobiography, which I'm about to read to you. This is about Dr. Stebbins, who was a minister. And there is an anecdote about Matthew in here. From 1855 to 1861, the political skies were ablaze, and every man had to choose between freedom and slavery, for the time had arrived when there was no neutral ground. The command had gone forth anew to choose God or mammon, and it was expected that everyone would speak out. The leading men, and especially the clergy, had committed themselves, but the great Dr. Stebbins had not spoken. The old stone church walls had not rang out the Jubilee. The tongue of the old bell in the belfry seemed as paralyzed as was the tongue of the pulpit. And we black abolitionists feared that the pro-slavery element in the church, as it was strong there, had intimidated the great Stebbins. I could not believe it, for he had talked to me too often while cutting his hair for me to believe it possible. One day it was announced in the papers that on Thursday evening the Reverend Mr. Stebbins would define his position on the slavery question. Well, don't you forget that all of us, quote, long heels, as we were called, who spoke in favor of emancipation, were there. Some were expecting, some hoping, some fearing, some doubting, all praying that the great preacher would speak out boldly for freedom and declare the whole truth despite position, salary, little page turn there, or friendship. But to our chagrin and great disappointment, Not a word had been spoken, nor a hint given on the subject of chattel slavery. In the pew with me were Newell A. Foster, M.F. Whittier, brother of John G., the great poet, M.A. Blanchard, and Master Furbish. I whispered to Mr. Foster, "Do you believe that Mr. Stebbins is afraid to speak out as announced?" "I don't believe he is," he said. "Let us wait and see." We were all ready to hiss him if he did not declare himself. In a few moments he straightened up to his whole height. He was a tall man, and he never looked so tall to me as then. He said in a loud, firm voice, "I saw it announced a few days ago in the papers that I was to give, tonight, my opinion upon the slavery question. I take this opportunity to do so. I will not detain you long, for it is getting late. It is where the human begins, slavery ends, and I shall leave it to you to decide if our beloved brothers are human." We could not contain ourselves any longer. We just shouted. We free soldiers were satisfied and found nothing to offend and everything to approve in the definition he gave. So that's John M. Todd. He was a spiritualist, a fellow spiritualist with Matthew, and a fellow abolitionist at the same time. These other names that are mentioned here will show up when I talk about spiritualism in Portland in visiting another one of these graves. But that's John M. Todd. We're now approaching the Winslow plot. There's kind of a history going on here that I'll try to explain. This is the Winslow main stone, and then this is Nathan Winslow's plot right there. This is kind of interesting in the sense, I took an artistic shot of this earlier. You can see that these two have grown into the tree, or rather the tree has grown around them. Nathan Winslow was Matthew's friend and oftentimes employer in Portland. He owned a number of businesses, but he owned a stove business. I think he manufactured and sold them in Portland and did some innovating in that regard. And when Matthew and Abby lost their 11-month-old son, Joseph, in 1838, they briefly lived with his second cousin, as I believe, Richard Whittier, in Methuen. And that's where they started writing A Christmas Carol. Then in late 1838, they came to Portland because Matthew's brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, arranged with Nathan Winslow, who was a fellow Quaker, to take Matthew on in the firm. So some of the things I've been reading lately in the Portland transcript came from this period when they were also writing A Christmas Carol together. Very quickly, Nathan Winslow's stove business folded. There had been a panic of 1837 that had messed with the economy, and I'm thinking stoves were a high-ticket item, and it was hard to sell them probably in a bad economy, in a recession. At any rate, Matthew took it over with the partners. Long story, it's in my first book, and eventually that failed also. But he continued to work off and on for Nathan. When he was out of work, he could go, and Nathan had some business or other. Eventually, Nathan Winslow got into the corn canning business, green corn, and made a success of that, as I understand. That's kind of what he's known for now, but that was some years later. So what I'm going to do is read you a letter, the actual physical letter, which I did read from and show you very early on in this series. It's written by Nathan Winslow. It's a business letter. It concerns Matthew, but by my lights, it's written in Matthew's hand. Matthew had a calligrapher's handwriting, bookkeeper's handwriting, and he would sometimes write letters for people. So apparently he wrote the letter for Nathan, even though Nathan dictated it. And I'm going to read that. Because it's windy, I've got little pieces of foam core on the front and the back, and I'm in a piece of plastic, and I'm going to have to slide those foam cores out to read the front and the back. All right, I think I maybe have the angle now. I know this isn't going to be very good video. It's very high contrast out here. But what I'm going to do is to remove the foam core from the front, just slide it out, and I'll read it here, and then I'll have to stop and put the foam core back in and so on. And I may not be able to read all of it, but I should be able to read Matthew's handwriting more or less. He's writing to a Mr. Perry in Bristol. Dear Sir, yours of the 16th came duly to hand, and I was pleased to learn that you had instructed your agent to vote in favor of the contemplated street. This is Commercial Street in Portland that they were building. This is March 22nd of 1850, so they were getting ready to build Commercial Street along the waterfront. But still, we have not secured it. There is a very powerful remonstrance against it, and 3 or 4 of the remonstrants are the most wealthy men in the city. I'm going to take my mask off. I don't need this thing on here. Okay. Should they ultimately defeat the enterprise, I shall feel very much chagrined after the effort I have made in its favor. The appraisal of the stores by the city was an informal one, and there is a committee now appointed who will, I think, increase the damages. I have used my influence to have the, I don't get that word, something, semonization increased. Though the stores to be taken away are the oldest and most worthless, being only 30 feet by 20, and settle down below the wharf from 2 to 3 feet. And though I should prefer selling at 300 rather than stop the street, I don't understand, rather than something the street, yet I have done all I could to have the price raised, but I cannot tell what the result will be, as the appraisers, and now I have to stop for a second and put the foam car in and flip the page. All right, here we are. I saved you from getting dizzy by deleting that part. Decline giving an opinion until they make their report. I am not desirous to own any more real estate in our city than what I want to occupy, as taxes are now very high and will be higher, and 2.5% is the lowest rate of insurance. But the stores on Union Wharf are so small that I want to get the control of 2 joining each other and build to suit me, or get a man to build with me and let me his half. In my former letter, I gave you a statement of facts to which you can refer, but did not state who made the sales. Number 9 was sold by Judge W. Pitt Preble for $800. Judge Preble was the president of the railroad and a strong advocate for the street, and as confident of the new streets being made as anyone among us. That's a big name here. Preble is a big name in Portland. Ever since I was burnt out, I have been trying to get a suitable place to build disconnected with others, and I thought I could exchange and get 2 stores together. I wish to buy for myself and M.F. Whittier. Now this is how I can know that it's Matthew's writing, because we actually have his signature in this. Your vacant lot, and will take your number 11 with it at a fair price, and wish to know your price cash, something 60 or 90 days, and on 12 months with a year interest in advance, with a year's interest in advance, or in bonds such as I show you, which shew you means, I think, past tense of show, which fall due in a little over 2 years, with semi-annual interest in coupons. If we trade, I should prefer doing the business with Judge Whitman or Samuel Fessenden, Esquire, of this city. This trade will leave you those stores as well situated as any on the wharf. The street, if it goes, will take your number 11. Mr. Merrill has several times asked me to make him an offer for the vacant share and number 11, but said he should not recommend you to sell the other stores at present. Respectfully yours, Nathan Winslow. Now, Merrill is also a big name here. We got like a fort named after Preble, and we've got a coroner named after Merrill and all those things now, so I'm familiar with these names, you know, but these were just like rich guys at the time. What I find is that I have been using a font that I made out of Matthew's handwriting, and I use it for my own private journal just for fun. I can read his handwriting now much better than I used to be able to because I'm accustomed to looking at it, you know. So I hardly made any stumbles in here, you know. Previously I would have read this and would have been just, you know, picking through it, trying to read something. So that's kind of interesting in itself. So I have no idea what Nathan Winslow looked like. I have no images of him, and I don't think he'd be recognizable down there now. But anyway, so that's a little something about Nathan Winslow. We are now approaching the grave of Edward Elwell. Edward Elwell was a very prominent person in Portland. He was the editor of the Portland Transcript for many years after Charles Isley. And strangely enough, despite how prominent he was, we see that they have his stone covered by a huge bush. So there we see his last name. If we want to walk around this, that's his son. If we want to walk around here, we can see Edward on the other side, and presumably his actual stone may be somewhere else here. Let's see. I don't see it right off. Edward H. Elwell, E-H-E. So this is his actual grave that we are standing at here. Now, there's a very strange history and relationship between Matthew Franklin Whittier and Edward Elwell. They had to have been friends. Matthew and Edward Elwell had to have known each other well. Matthew submitted most of his Ethan Spike stories after, say, 1850 to the Portland Transcript, and yet Edward Elwell in the historical record seems to act as though Matthew doesn't exist and he doesn't know who he is. So it's very strange. There's two possible explanations. One of them is that they had a falling out, and the other one, which I think is more plausible, is that Matthew requested anonymity from every one of the editors that he worked for, and that Edward Elwell, of all of them, took him quite literally and just erased every mention of Matthew from his diary, which I got into his diary, and in his diary it looks as though he doesn't know who Matthew is, because he mentions Lizzie's daughter becoming engaged to his employee Samuel Picard, and mentions her. He says he thinks she is the niece of the poet John Greenleaf Whittier. Well, you know, it's Matthew's daughter, the man that had been writing for him for years, whom he has extolled in an obituary, or would extol in an obituary, when Matthew died in 1883, whom he had praised when Matthew moved to Portland, and so on. So it's very, very strange. Unless he didn't know that Matthew was the author of Ethan Spike, which I think is extremely unlikely. Certainly later on he did. So it's a weird picture. When Edward Elwell gave a talk, a particular talk, he extolled the writing of James Russell Lowell as having kind of established the Yankee dialect style, when actually James Russell Lowell was imitating Matthew's Ethan Spike in the chronotype. That I can prove. So it's a very strange picture. I'm going to read a couple examples of these things, and we'll at least get a sense for what I'm talking about here. All right, I'm going to read to you from a book that Edward Elwell wrote called Portland and Vicinity Illustrated, which is here. This is a little bit awkward, so bear with me. Of course, I don't want to damage these antiquarian books, so I'm going to hold this one rather gingerly. And this is actually 2 or 3 pages. It's way more than I can read comfortably, but he goes into great depth about the authors. He's already talked about a great number of authors whom he
in which he hasn't mentioned Matthew, and then he goes on to journalists. Among journalists, we must not omit mention of Benjamin Titcomb and Thomas B. Waite, who on the 1st of January, 1785, etc., he's back in ancient history. In 1803, Nathaniel Willis, father of N.P. Willis the poet, commenced the publication of the Eastern Argus. He goes on like that. And then he does talk about Charles Isley, his predecessor. In 1837, Charles P. Isley started the Portland Transcript, which he edited for 10 years, enriching its columns with many interesting tales from his graceful pen. Well, we've seen Charles Isley and how he could write. And he talks about Benjamin Kingsbury, who I believe was one of Matthew's contemporaries in the spiritualist movement. Then Newell A. Foster, I think we've seen that name. And he also talks about Reverend Russell Streeter, Honorable William Willis, Isaac Adams, Honorable F.O.J. Smith, William Pett Fessenden, which name I recognize, John A. Poor, S.B. Beckett, whom we're going to visit in just a little bit, Henry Carter, Professor E.P. Weston, who also helped edit the transcript, and quite a number of others. Now let me stop and go back here for a second. Page 29, among reformers, we may claim Neil Dow, and he goes on like that. Matthew was a reformer also. Portland is the birthplace of many authors, some of whom have achieved a wide fame and conferred honor on the place of their nativity. Of course, Matthew wasn't born in Portland. Of poets, we may mention first, by right of seniority, the late John Neal. And let's see. He goes on to Henry Longfellow, of course, and pictures of them are here. Hold on a second. Nathaniel Deering, who very much admired Matthew's Ethan Spike to the point of imitating him. I mean, with Matthew's permission, no doubt. He was a founding father, but he was a member of the Nixian Club, which Matthew also was a member of, the debate club in Portland. And Matthew mentions him as Old Nat or something like that in correspondence, so they were friends. Among the writers of tales and romance, which Matthew also was, J.H. Ingram, Charles P. Isley, whose tales of Indian warfare and frontier life in Maine have been very popular, Elijah Kellogg, George Payson, Samuel Coleman, Mrs. Ann S. Stevens, the prolific novelist, Elizabeth Payson Prentice, Mrs. Clara Barnes Martin. And he talks about Bishop Horatio Southgate written travels, which Matthew was expert in writing travels, as we'll see in a minute. And on and on. Let's see, distinguished authors in theology, which Matthew actually also was. Biography, Matthew wrote fall biographies, pretend biographies. In other words, he goes on and on and on and never mentions Matthew, the author of Ethan Spike, who was his author in the Portland Transcript. Now that's 1881. Now we're going to turn to the year of Matthew's death. This is January 13, 1883. Matthew died, I believe, on the 7th of 1883. I'm going to have to sit a little bit differently because I'm hurting my feet. There we go. Let's try that. That's not going to work either. All right, I can't sit Indian style. It doesn't work for me. The death of Matthew F. Whittier, who died at East Boston on Sunday last, aged 70 years, will be regretted by many who knew that pleasant gentleman during his residence in this city. Mr. Whittier was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and was the brother of the poet John G. Whittier. Matthew's name is never mentioned without his brother, of course. He came to Portland in 1839, actually it was 1838, and for many years was in the employ of the late Nathan Winslow, whom we've met, the originator of the corn packaging business. In 1861, Mr. Whittier removed to Boston to take a position in the custom house there, which he retained until within 3 months of his death. Mr. Whittier had a strong vein of humor and was the author of the Ethan Spike letters, which for many years appeared originally in the columns of this paper. So he knows this as of 1883. Presumably he knew it when he wrote his book in 1880 or 81. These letters were admirably true to the Yankee character and vernacular, and their satire was very effective. They attained a wide circulation in the newspaper press and gave Mr. Whittier a high place among American humorists. Well, if he had such a high place, why wasn't he in the book? Mr. Whittier's health has been failing for some time past, and his death was not unexpected. It is a severe shock to his brother, the poet, the closest affection having always existed between them, which was actually not true. They were estranged for many years. Mr. Whittier was the father of Charles F. Whittier of this city, and one of his daughters is the wife of Samuel T. Picard of the Transcript. Actually, Charles Whittier also ended up working for the Transcript. So it's not entirely accurate. It's a little bit sugar-coated. But to completely leave Matthew out of his diary and his book and his talk, and yet write like this, unless Samuel Picard wrote this, which I doubt. I would guess that this was Elwell. It's very strange. You know, I don't understand it. But I think Edward Elwell was a good guy. I think he was brilliant. He was extremely smart, worldly wise, good-hearted guy on the right side of things generally. He came from a long line of ship captains, and I think he ran his newspaper like a ship. He didn't want it to sink. So he was liberal, but he would print radical material only to a point, and then he would refuse it. I've got examples of him refusing to print some of Matthew's stuff. So he was a little bit careful. He was, you know, he didn't want to lose his paper, but he ran it for a very long time. I think it was the longest running paper in Portland under him. I think he was somebody that you wanted on your side. You wouldn't want to be on the other side. I think he was involved in the anti-slavery movement in ways that nobody will ever know, is my feeling. Came up for me under hypnosis. And I think he's an admirable person, whether he slighted Matthew for good reasons or bad. We are now approaching the plot for the Becketts. This is S.B. Beckett, or Sylvester Beckett, who was born the same year as Matthew. He was a writer, an author in Portland, Maine. I've looked up some of his work, and it strikes me, to be perfectly honest, as similar in some respects to Matthew's work in terms of dialogue, but it's as though he took Matthew's idea about dialogue and grafted it onto a rather staid style of prose. Whether he was really imitating Matthew's work or not, I don't know. I don't know how long their friendship or relationship lasted, how far back it went. But I can't find his stone. However, rather like my teeth, we see one missing here. You may have noticed that I don't have I'm missing a lot of back teeth. That's a result of being poor most of my life, which is a result of being shunned. When you're shunned, you're poor. When you're poor, you can't afford dental work. So a lot of poor people have missing teeth. I learned that when I worked for a dentist very briefly. Anyway, I'm guessing that that is S.B. Beckett's stone, but I don't know. So I think what I'll do when I read here is to park myself in front of this large monument. All right, so I'm going to park myself in front of the monument here. I apologize for the backlighting. It's just the way it ended up this time of day. Beckett shows up in Matthew's life in a couple different areas. First of all, he was a spiritualist, and we will get to that in a minute. He was also an author, as I was just saying, and I don't think he was that good an author, really. I think that he borrowed from Matthew, but I can't prove that. I'll tell you that my reaction to his, here I finally figured out where to look after the series is over practically. I'll tell you my feeling at looking at his portrait, which is a bas relief, I think they call it, in sculpture, is negative. I don't like him. And yet, I would guess he had money because that's a pretty big monument. You could tell which families had money by the size of the monument. And this is a pretty big one, although his stone is gone. I don't know why somebody kicked it over. Maybe somebody doesn't like him. Somebody else doesn't like him, like more than me. But anyway, be that as it may, he comes up as an author, and he comes up as a fellow spiritualist in the Portland Spiritualist Association, which again we'll get to in a minute. As an author, it appears that Matthew ghost wrote a travel guide for him. It was a railroad travel guide for the railways around Portland, leading from Portland. Matthew, in recent years, had traveled extensively through the New England states, apparently as a postal inspector, writing a series, travelogue series called Quails, or by Quails for the Boston Weekly Museum and a number of other travelogues concurrently, which is a whole nother story. But Matthew had the personal experience. He also had the ability to write about nature and the quality of prose that one sees in the travel guide. I can tell by style, having studied over 2,300 of Matthew's published works, that this is definitely Matthew's work, and I seriously doubt it's S.B. Beckett's. I was lucky enough to get hold of the proof copy, the one that contains Matthew's original language, but that Beckett, I would gather, made notes in and corrections and changes in. So I can see Matthew's original work. Now, I've read from this before, but I'm going to read from it now. Here is our proof copy. This is Portland, White Mountains and Montreal Railroad Guide, Portland, published by Foster, Jarish and Company. And S.B. Beckett's name is on this as the author. Again, it's not his. I'm going to open it at random. Oops, sorry. I'm going to open it at random and read. 19-Mile Brook. The Glen House is in the midst of streams and brooks which abound with trout, not to mention in this connection the teeming Peabody. The principal one of these is 19-Mile Brook, so designated because the point where it crosses the Pinkham Road about half a mile below the house is just 19 miles from the boundary of Conway. It is a most romantic, sorry, I'm juggling all these things. It is a most romantic stream working its way through rocky glens and forests whose lonely seclusions have never been explored excepting by the adventurous hunters, having its source in the gorge between Height and Carter Mountains some 3 or 4 miles up. The fisher who possesses an ordinary degree of skill can hardly fail of procuring an abundance of trout in its dark pools and shady ripples in all weathers. Near the source of this stream, among the wooded steeps and shattered crags that burst up into the sky in the wildest forms, is a deep lakelet, whose waters approach in clearness the atmosphere itself, a perfect gem of the wilderness. Its western borders are overshadowed by a ragged precipice from 300 to 400 feet in perpendicular height, crowned with forests, and with this for a baseline, its shore describes a semicircle and is fringed with a sandy beach which is seldom trod except by the wild deer who come here to drink. So that's not the most romantic passage of the whole book. I literally picked one at random, but portions of it are just gorgeously written. And that is Matthew. Now, let's see. Now I have I believe it's the 1855 edition of the Portland Transcript. And in here, someone, I believe it's Matthew, because he's the one that wrote for the transcript. We have a woodpecker going on here. Wrote for the Spiritualist Association, and in particular for a group who had experimentally studied a seance or a series of seances, mediumistic readings, and they record the physical mediumship that was accomplished in those seances. And it's done rigorously. These people studied scientifically in 1855, which is way before the Society for Psychical Research was developed, as I recall. That was 1890 or something. So these are real pioneers. That means that if I am Matthew Franklin Whittier's reincarnation, which I can prove many times over that I am, that this is not my first lifetime rigorously studying the paranormal. Now, it's going to be very tricky for me to open this volume. I will show it to you here. This is a beautiful copy. I mean, it's in beautiful shape of the 55 Portland Transcript, and I don't want to open it all the way. It's going to be very tricky for me to read here. I'm not even sure quite how to proceed with this because I don't know if I can see it from here. I'm going to do my best. You're going to see the top of my head, I'm afraid. I can't hold it up with one hand without hurting the spine. Spiritual music, testimony of witnesses. We publish below, by request, the testimony of several well-known citizens in regard to the reality of the musical manifestations of the spirits, an account of which we gave last week. probably they gave a skeptical, because Edward Elwell was skeptical of these things, so it was probably skeptical, and they wanted to show that this is real. I'm going to read at length. Matthew's name is among the signers at the end, so if you're getting bored, I want you to know ahead of time that Matthew is among the signers who say that they witnessed these phenomena personally, okay? A committee from the Portland Association for Investigating Spiritual Phenomena, having been requested by Mr. Cyrus Lord to investigate certain musical manifestations purporting to be made by departed human spirits through his daughter as medium, the genuineness of which had been questioned by certain persons who declared that they had detected the medium producing the manifestations herself, the undersigned, which Matthews included, is small type, so I have to, when I look up, I have to look back down again to find my place. Members of said community represent that they have, with great carefulness and a full determination to give everything the most rigid scrutiny, been cognizant of several exhibitions in this city, such as are above alluded to, and hereby express their full conviction that in all thus witnessed there was no collusion, imposition, or deception practiced on the part of Mr. Lord's daughter or any other medium or person present, and freely aver as follows. I think I will probably cut in pictures of the type here, just so you don't have to stare at the top of my head, which is fine, you know, as bald heads go, but the type will be more interesting. That a bass drum, snare drum, melodeon, tambourine, triangle, double bass viol, accordion, and guitar were played upon loudly and distinctly, while the hands of the medium were held by one of the committee. That several of the instruments were taken up and carried over our heads when they had been so arranged as to make it absolutely impossible for any person present to move them without detection. That the medium was taken up in her chair and placed upon the table, without, as the committee fully believed, the intervention of mortal hands. That spirit lights, that spirit lights were exhibited on the wall and in several places in the absence of all other lights. That the guitar was placed upon the head of a member of the committee, and in that position had familiar tunes played upon it, while the hands of the medium were on the hands of another member of the committee. That the melodeon, while placed against a wide table separating it from the medium, was inflated and played upon, the person nearest it having his hands and feet held by members of the committee. Besides these, there were numerous other manifestations of an equally marvelous character, where collusion on the part of any mediums present was, in our opinion, impossible, and although these manifestations were produced in the dark, still the arrangements were such as to render it certain in the judgment of the committee that they were accomplished without the aid of mortal hands, all of which we declare without hesitation or reservation. It is proper to add that clairvoyant mediums present, belonging in this city and above suspicion, state that they saw spirit hands play the instruments, and one saw the spirit of an elderly man playing the double bass, which by her description was identified as the former owner of the instrument. And now the signatures in caps and small caps, starting with S.B. Beckett, Jeremiah Dow, J.S. Palmer, James Furbish, S. Thorpe, J.K. King, N.A. Foster, M.F. Whittier, Elliot F. Clark, Enoch Carlton, E.W. Locke, and then there's a caveat by Locke saying that he was present but 2 evenings. And there's more that goes on under that, but you know, now, could they have been fooled? I've thought about this quite a bit. If it was pitch dark, if somebody was able to slip into the room, or there was a Confederate among the members of the committee, they could possibly have dressed all in black and played these instruments. And they could even have gotten the medium up on the table if she herself climbed on the table. Somebody put the chair on top of the table, and then she climbed into it. The light on the wall is a little trickier because we're talking 1855, before electricity. you had lamps. It's possible to shield a lamp so that the light only comes out of one little snout, theoretically, so that with that they could possibly have projected light onto the wall. To make it so black that no light was thrown back on the person holding it, even if they were wearing a black robe, would have been pretty tough. Because when the general light level is raised by a spot of light on the room, I would think, or the little bit that's thrown back would have revealed somebody wearing a dark outfit. I think. It'd have to be tested to see if you could do that. Can you get in a dark room using a lantern and project lights on the wall in such a way that, they can't be made out? Or could the wall have had a very thin spot so that somebody on the other side of the wall projected light onto it? There's always little things you can think of that somebody might possibly have done. But you're also talking, 5 or 6 very astute people, aren't easily fooled, and they were determined not to be fooled. They also vouched for the character of the mediums. So any kind of trickery is probably far less likely than that those were actual physical manifestations. Anyway, it proves one thing, and that is that in my previous or earlier lifetime in the 19th century, I was attempting to rigorously study paranormal phenomena. And that's pretty strong paranormal evidence in itself, I would say. So that's where S.B. Beckett comes in. I'll tell you, I think that he came from a privileged family. You kind of get that impression by the big monument. It's, let's see, tilt it that way. You can see it's pretty big. To have his likeness carved in stone like that, looking like a Roman emperor or somebody, But in all groups like this, there's usually at least one person that has some family money, else they can't function. So they may not be the most astute, they may be troublesome, but they help to fund the thing, see? So without knowing for sure, that's my impression about S.B. Beckett. We are now coming up the steps to the Whittier graves, and it's kind of odd because this big obelisk here is Dennett and Neal. Now, it says Dennett on the front, but the only Dennett is the fellow who was married to Lydia Neal. And all the rest of them listed here are Neals. Peace Neal, Stephen Neal, David Neal, Lucy Neal, Lydia Neal, and so on, who died most of them were actually through the whole century, starting in 1807 and ending in 1881. And then, I don't know who we have here, because on the other side you really can't read it. And then we have Whittiers. Now, how these Whittiers ended up in the Neal-Dennett plot, I don't know, but there's not really any other stones. So what I'm going to do before I read anything is to give my impressions. These two, I'm not sure who they are. They're relatives, nieces or nephews, I think. Here we have Matthew's second wife, Jane Vaughan. She was a resident of St. John, born in St. John, Canada. I have extrapolated something that the Whittier legacy has completely forgotten, and that is that Matthew's mother, as a busybody, arranged for Matthew to marry this woman sight unseen in Portland, Maine, almost exactly a year after Abby had died. And the only reason that he would have ever done such a thing is if he felt that Abby had wanted him to. And the only way that could have happened is if his mother attended a seance, which she did during this period, and reported to him that Abby had come through and wanted him to marry this woman sight unseen. Then he would have done it. Otherwise, he would never have done it. It was a disastrous marriage. He had 3 children by this woman. He couldn't get along with her. They were totally mismatched. I think that his mother picked her to keep Matthew in line, and not because she thought that they were really compatible. Matthew didn't live at home as of the fall of 1844. He moved to New York City and began writing for the New York Tribune and he would come home and visit his children and his wife. At that time, he, I think, tried to stay faithful to her and was faithful to her, but he couldn't love her. He was still very deeply in love with Abby. As of about 1847 or 48, he was really emotionally finished with this marriage, even though he had a third child in 48. And Abby began contacting him in spirit. He began to have spirit visitation dreams from Abby, I believe. He ended this marriage, separated. It wasn't easy to get a divorce, but he separated as of mid-1849, as near as I can tell. About that time, he had a brief, disastrous relationship. Now, whether it was before he officially separated from Jane or after, I don't know. It was well after he'd emotionally separated from her and wasn't living with her, but it's kind of hard to tell. But that marriage was officially over, I would say, separated anyway, as of mid-1849, not as the historians would have it. The curator at the Haverhill Library, whom I spoke to in 2005, I think, right after I discovered Matthew, told me that this woman was, quote, a battle axe. So it's not just my own opinion. I will be reading a little bit from what I believe to be stories that Matthew told B.P. Shillaber, his editor and friend, about this marriage, which Shillaber fashioned into a series of stories about Blifkins, the martyr. Here we have Matthew's firstborn, his son Charles Franklin Whittier. This stone tells us that he was the nephew of John Greenleaf Whittier. There's no mention of Matthew. You can see how close the two stones are. And the photograph that we have of Jane, the only one, comes from Charles's effects. I'm going to read you a letter that Matthew wrote in response to a letter from Charles asking for help getting a job in 1860, I believe it was. And but basically, Charles appears to have sided with his mother in all respects. He was the first. He didn't have the benefit of much of Matthew's company. And I have a strong past life memory which tells me that among other faults of Jane Vaughan's, she tried to turn the children against him. She tried to poison the children's mind against Matthew and try to prevent them from seeing him, after they separated. I remember her as a very political person, the kind of person that would have done very well in politics, except women weren't admitted in politics. So she practiced politics in her family. I think she had some virtues. I understand that she loved animals, which they would have had in common, maybe the only thing they had in common. And I would say in her defense that I have been in the position of being in love with someone who was in love with somebody else that they lost one way or another. And it's a very painful experience to love someone who is busy grieving for someone else. And I would say that she was put in that situation. Now, how Mrs. Whittier, Matthew's mother, represented it, I don't know, but Matthew should never have remarried. His heart was Abby's for the rest of his life, really. Certainly at this period, he was not available to love anybody else. So it was probably very painful for her. Now, over on this side, we have Matthew's third child, his daughter Alice, whose nickname was Allie. I'm going to read you a poem that Matthew wrote to Allie. She's here with her husband, Wilbur, who I believe was a blacksmith. Now, she was born 1849, probably conceived 1848, right towards the end of that marriage. Wilbur was born 1840. He died in 1897. She died the following year in 1898. I'm saying this was marriage for love. And this is the one child of the three that he was actually able to spend time with, because he moved to Portland, Maine. Instead of traveling around as he had been as a postal inspector, he moved and worked for the post office in Portland and had a place of his own, a separate place. And he would bring her there on weekends, or who knows what the arrangement was. And that way he had a part in raising her. So he understood, or she understood rather, I would say from Matthew's stories about him and Abby, what real soulmates were like. So she, as the other two, did not have successful marriages, in my opinion. The boy never married, and Elizabeth, the second child, married in a bad marriage to Samuel Picard, who I think was a closet sociopath. But Allie married for love, and they had a successful marriage, and they were so close that she passed on. She finally left this world a year after he did, see. So I think that's partly due to Matthew's influence. Um, I think that Matthew and Alice were especially close, and you'll see in the poem that I'm about to read. But that's the three that are buried here, plus the two. There's one, Abby, Abbie, who I think was possibly one of Alice and Wilbur's children. I'm not sure. I haven't spent the $20 to get on Ancestry.com to look it up. At any rate, those are the ones that are buried here. The others are buried in Union Cemetery along with Matthew in Amesbury, Massachusetts. I visited that and photographed a little bit of that and videotaped a little bit of myself in front of that stone. And I'm not going to drive out there to do that again for this series. But I will proceed to read some relevant material. I'm going to read a letter that Matthew wrote to his son Charles, from Portland on July 21st, 1860. It's a response to a letter. Apparently Charles had written him asking for help getting a job. And this is what Matthew wrote. It's a long story what his situation is, but basically the economy's bad and he's having trouble getting work himself, and he's got a lot of personal issues to deal with, which I know but won't elaborate at this point. And he's quite depressed and he's unable to help his son. So I'm going to read here. My dear Charlie, I received your letter and am glad to learn that your health is good and that you have a place in the store. I would have got you a place here had it been possible, but business in Portland has been getting worse and worse for 3 years. I never knew it so bad here as it is now. I do not think if I had no place it would be possible for me to get anything to do. I have not much of a place as it is. I get but a mere trifle of a salary, and were it not for the little I pick up by posting books and averaging and adjusting accounts for outside parties, together with now and then something from the transcript and other papers, I could not get along at all. Mr. Winslow and his partner, Mr. Jones, have dissolved their partnership, and I shall probably soon lose the place, such as it is. If Lincoln should get elected, I can probably obtain an office, if I can contrive to keep along until he is inaugurated. I shall take a part in the campaign as well as I can, though I do not feel much enthusiasm or courage. I do not feel well and have many things to trouble me. Sometimes I can't help wishing my harassed and, I fear, useless life ended. However, I must make the best of it while it lasts. If I felt well and strong, or if I was not troubled quite so much, I could so work in this political campaign that if the Republicans are successful, I could probably get a very good office, but I shall do as well as I can. If the Republicans, remember Republicans are liberals, if the Republicans are beaten, I shall probably be compelled to leave Portland. I have an offer to go to Indiana, where I think I can do better than here. But I would prefer staying here if I can get employment and live with base comfort and peace. Allie did not go to St. John. She boards with her Aunt Sarah. I intended to have visited Massachusetts ere this, but have not felt able to spare the time or the money. Give my love to your uncle and aunt when you see them, and do the best you can. That's John Greenleaf Whittier and Elizabeth. Goodbye, my dear boy. Affectionately, your father, M.F. Whittier. Now, as regards Matthew's second wife, Jane Vaughan, whose stone you see behind me here, I am going to read a story from the Blifkins' The Martyr series, which was written and published by Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, Matthew's friend and collaborator, based, as I believe, on stories that Matthew had told Shillaber about this second marriage. This one is particularly interesting because it provides some very strong evidence that Matthew was the original author of The Raven. Now, I'm not going to stop and point out all of the clues. I'm going to tell you ahead of time that Mr. Blifkins is Matthew, that Mrs. Blifkins is Jane, that the widow Thompson is Abby, who is actually visiting him in a spirit dream, and the rest of it, the bust of Pallas was literally in Matthew's office above his chamber door, as he says it was in The Raven, even though here Shillaber has rather mixed and matched and, you know, kind of messed with the facts in this story. You have to pick it out a little bit. What it means is that toward the end of this marriage, Matthew, who had always been in love with Abby, was getting spirit visitation dreams from her. And Shillaber mocked him on that account, didn't believe in it or didn't think that it was, you know, something he should be doing. And that's what this reflects. Now this is going to be a little tricky. I have to hold this book open at the same time that I try to hold this up. There we go. I'm going to read this entire story if my feet hold out, because they're a bit uncomfortable the way I'm sitting here. And again, I'm not going to stop to point anything out. This is a spirit visitation dream from Abby, where you see Abby connected with a star and the moon. This is, Abby loved the stars. Whenever Matthew brings Abby into a story, the stars are always there. I've mentioned to you that I thought the word sublunary was one of their favorites, so you will see that Abby's also connected with the moon here. Blifkin's moonlight trip. I never told you about my moonlight excursion last summer, said Blifkins, smiling, as he sat and gazed, quote, upon the bust of Pallas just above our study door. There was something provokingly funny in his look, and he drummed the hallelujah upon the chair, looking up at the bust aforesaid, as though he were exchanging private signals with the insensate plaster. What excursion was that? We asked, looking up from the work whereon we were engaged. He burst into a laugh, long and loud, and his sides shook again with the accretive humor that had evidently been gathering strength for the present explosion when it could break out in an unembarrassed atmosphere. Such boisterousness was unusual to him, and indeed it was offensive, because the sacredness of the editorial precinct, given to grave meditation, should not be profaned by exuberance that finds voice above the breath, and we checked him by telling him not to make a donkey of himself by braying so unseemly. He kept on laughing, though moderating his tone, and then said, "In the Nellie Baker." "Why, the Nellie Baker has stopped running for a month," we said. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he replied, "the most curious thing that ever happened to me, and one which I have wanted to tell you for a long time. I thought of it just as I came in here and looked at that bust. Whose is it?" "Pallas." "Pallas, is it?" he continued, "but it looks amazingly like the widow Thompson." "And pray, who may be the widow Thompson?" we asked, looking Blifkins in the eye, and through that avenue away down into his soul. "Who is she?" He smiled mysteriously in reply, still beating the hallelujah on the arm of the chair, and turned his eyes again towards the bust of Pallas. "Well, the matter was here," he said. "Spear of the Nellie Baker invited me to go down in the harbor on one of the moonlight excursions that they had last summer, and I went home with the invitation fresh in my mind to induce my wife to go with me. The normal condition of Mrs. Blifkin's mind being opposition, of course, as soon as I mentioned it with all the eloquent force of my enthusiastic temper, she met it with a rebuff that almost drove me out of the house. I was, I confess, a little discomposed at this, having expected a different reception for a proposition that sought her happiness, and seated myself moodily by the table, with my head upon my hand, thinking, I am constrained to say, upon other scenes than those that surrounded me, and another form than that which made the central figure of my domestic picture, murmuring to myself inside, it might have been. Excuse the digression, but Whittier has by those few words let many people into the secret of their unhappiness who never otherwise would have dreamt of it. Had he been a married man, he never would have written them for politic reasons. I was giving way to these fancies when, Mr. Blifkins, said my wife, you know I'm tired to death, delving and slaving all day, and that's the reason why you ask me to go, I suppose, thinking I will refuse. I'll go. Why will you impute such mean motives to me? I asked. Must I be your devoted slave for another 25 years before you are convinced of my devotedness? She made no reply. The night was a charming one. The full moon made everything bright and beautiful, and a refreshing breeze swept over the water, cooling the fever that the day had caused. There was a large party on board, a curious mixture of materials thrown together at random, and as incongruous as well could be. All were ripe for a good time, which was the harmonizing element, the oil that neutralized antagonisms and fused the mass into saponaceous completeness. Soap, we said. Don't interrupt me, please. The simile is a good one. We steamed down the river in fine style, the waves bright with moonbeams and sparkling like silver. The sound of dashing water is pleasant to the ear, and to me is suggestive of many dreams. I love to look over the rail and see the foamy wake that follows the stroke of the paddle wheels, and list to the hissing murmur that rises from the water, indulging in fantasies that realize the magic tales of Undine and the Naiads. That's a reference to Abby, Naiad. And it is not bad either to take a cigar and sit by the prow and watch the bone that ripples up from the sharp cutwater in a gentle and trickling song, as soothing as a lullaby. On coming aboard, I had introduced Mrs. Blifkins to my friend Hodges, and leaving her very busy in conversation with him, I was strolling to the forward part of the boat to enjoy a cigar, when a light hand was placed upon my arm as I emerged from the shadow of the awning, and a soft voice said, "Good evening, Mr. Blifkins." "Mrs. Thompson?" we queried, but without moving his eyes from the bust of Pallas, Blifkins went on. I started at the well-recognized tones, and there, unattended, was the widow Thompson. "My dear Mrs. Thompson," I said, "this is an unexpected pleasure. To what fortunate star am I indebted for this sweet surprise?" "That," she replied, pointing to the moon. "Thanks, most propitious planet," said I with enthusiasm. "Luna shall hereafter be my lodestar, and that the devils and the moon for mischief shall be placed among the forgotten slanders hatched in the poet's teeming brain." I took her hand as I spoke, and then we stood by the wheelhouse together and talked moonshine and the nonsense born of romance for many a mile. She informed me that she was on board in company with a young couple who had as much as they could do to think of themselves without looking after her, but thought it prudent to join them, which she did, and I returned to Mrs. Blifkins. "You are very gallant, I declare," said that excellent woman, leaving me in charge of others. "It was a fortunate thing that Mr. Hodges was on board, or I don't know what I should have done." "My love, it shows what confidence I put in you," I said, trembling, as conscience gave me a castigating thump. "I am not jealous, you know. Hodges pretended that he saw somebody he wished to speak to and hurried away, leaving me to Mrs. Blifkins. "Been enjoying yourself, I dare say," said she. "Entirely," replied I. "I thought I would go forward and smoke a cigar, and had an excellent time." "There must be a great deal of fascination in a cigar," she said tartly, "to attract a man away from his wife at such a time." "I thought you were very comfortable with Hodges," I replied. "A good fellow is Hodges." "He will do," she replied, "if one cannot have one's husband to speak to." I endeavored to make myself agreeable. I pointed out the beauties of shore and sea, talked poetry, improvised speeches, essayed apostrophes, but it all fell on unheeding ears, and I was not glad when the boat stopped at Nahant. "Hodges," said I, look after my wife again, will you? Your eloquence has so eclipsed mine that all I can say fails to move her. You are a fascinating fellow," chucking him under the ribs as I spoke. I was glad to see him as carefully handing her up the steep steps at the landing as though she were made of glass. She looked round at me with eyes of wonderful indifference, I thought, and as she disappeared above the bank, I gazed upon the other climbers, and close by my side was Mrs. Thompson. "Bless me," said I, holding out my hand, "how fortunate! Allow me," and I assisted her up. Taking my arm, we walked along together, communing most delightedly. Her delicate hand burned and palpitated on my coat sleeve. and its electric influence coursed through the veins of my arm and thence to my heart. "Blessings on the hour that brought you here," I said, "and blessed be the moon whose power moved you to come." I hurried away with Mrs. Thompson upon my arm, and we seated ourselves by the sea, in the crevice of a rock that the cliffs overhung, and there, with the waves dashing at our feet, we enjoyed the full beauty of the scene. Said I, quoting poetry here, "In such a night as this, when the sweet wind did gently kiss the trees, and they did make no noise, in such a night, Troilus, methinks, mounted the Trojan walls, and sighed his soul towards the Grecian tents, where Cressid lay that night." "Mr. Blifkin," said my wife, looking round a projecting angle of the rock, "are you smoking again?" She disappeared as she spoke, and we sauntered along the sands, throwing pebbles into the water that almost laved our feet, as happy as children, and innocent as the babes in the wood. We stood in the shadows and looked out upon the sea, heaving like our own hearts with emotion, and looked into each other's eyes, tender with mellow light, and we sighed, "It might have been." Her thoughts perhaps were with the deceased Thompson. Where were mine? "Mr. Blifkin," said my wife. Mrs. Thompson's hand slipped from my arm. The sea rolled away, bearing her off on its breast. The rocks settled to a grave. The moonlight grew opaque, and a passing seafowl gave me a smart rap on the ear. "Mr. Blifkin," said my wife, "wake up." "Has the boat gone?" said I, starting from my seat at the table where I had dozed. "Where's Hodges and the widow Thompson?" "Who?" said my wife, in a tone that made the rims of my hat curl up as I put it on my head. "Who?" "Nothing, my dear, nothing," replied I. "It was a dream, that's all, and half of life is but little better." We didn't go on the excursion. 'Tis wonderful how much that bust of Pallas looks like Mrs. Thompson. Said we, "Blifkins, you are in a bad way. Drink cooling fluids, eat no meat, abstain from stimulants. The dream of Mrs. Thompson is but the residuum of bad fancies, and the sooner you are rid of them, the better." So, what's happened here, of course, is that Matthew can't get along with Jane at all, has nothing in common with her, and he's still very much in love with Abby, who comes to him in his dreams, and who, it so happens, looks quite a bit like the bust of Pallas, which was found in Herculaneum. And Matthew loved the Hallelujah chorus, and as did Abby. Abby used to play and sing. She was a musical prodigy. She loved the stars. She loved the moon. So all of this is a metaphor for Matthew dreaming of contact with Abby while he's in this unfortunate arranged marriage with Jane Vaughan, whose stone you see behind me there. That may or may not have been a good one to pick. Matthew wasn't having a physical affair, and it wasn't just generic loneliness. Notice that he brings in John Greenleaf Whittier and the poem Maud Muller. It's clearly Matthew through the lens of Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber. This is going to be very interesting. I'm trying to read from a 2 years worth volume of the Portland Transcript. This, I believe, is the February 17th edition. I'm going to tilt down to see if you can see it. I'm trying to hold this huge volume in my hands and still read a poem. But this is a poem that Matthew is unsigned, but it's very near her birthday, written from January 15th, 1855 for the Portland Transcript. And this is definitely Matthew. He's writing about having Allie visit him in his little apartment after he and Jane have separated. Some years after they've separated, when he lived in Portland so that he could help raise her. And he writes, "Once more I hear her merry laugh of childish glee, ringing through the familiar rooms, so wild and free. Once more I hear her gentle voice calling at dawn, to leave my pleasant little room, to walk at morn. And oft, when weary of my books, for home I pine. Then whose sweet voice can cheer my heart, Allie, like thine? And then at evening's holy hour, when day has flown, thy voice upon the zephyr's breath floats with my own. And when all lonely here I sit with tearful eyes, who, with arms thrown around my neck, echoes my sighs? Who raises eyes of azure blue unto my face, as there, amid the frowns and smiles, my thoughts to trace. Is it not thou, sweet Ally dear? Dost thou not know no other on this wide, wide earth can cheer me so?
So there we have it. Maybe not the most brilliant production in terms of what they call production values, but considering I used a cell phone and was all by myself, I don't think I did too badly. With regard to that last poem about Allie, I'm not 100% certain that that was written by Matthew about his daughter, but I rather think so because there's a number of clues, but basically her birthday was February 17, and this was dated from February 19th, which means that this was published 2 days after her 7th birthday. And this is a weekly paper, so that's as close as he could get to her birthday. And that's quite a coincidence if it's not Matthew writing about his daughter Allie. But there's one line in there that doesn't quite make sense to me, and that's about him longing for home. This would be, say, 6 years after he had separated from Jane. So what home exactly is he longing for? I can't say for sure, but my gut feeling about this is that he was always considering his home his children. We see that in some of his written pieces and his letters. He seems to have no real emotional attachment to Jane, but he has a tremendous attachment to his children, even though she's been able to turn them away from him, which is a source of continuing sorrow for him, except for Allie, who, being the younger one and who he has helped raise because he's come back to live in Portland, he has more of a bond with than with the first two children. So I think he considers home his children and his children, his family, and Jane is the person that was kind of artificially grafted into his life, which literally happened because it was an arranged marriage and he never bonded with her in the first place. See, that's kind of my guess. So as regards this entire series, there is a kind of a strange, subtle effect that being in the cemetery for several days, first of all, and secondly, being in connection with these people who were close to Matthew, whom I basically can't remember cognitively. But all through this study, I found that close contact with these elements of Matthew's past life has a subconscious effect on me, which I really would be hard-pressed to explain. And the more that I'm connected with it, the more that it seems to affect me. And yet I can't articulate anything and I can't cognitively remember anything. So it's very much of a two-layer process. I feel a sense of incompleteness and a sense of frustration, and that I think that I reincarnated in this life to try to get straight. As far as any literary elements are concerned, I think Matthew wasn't taken seriously, and it's a chicken and egg situation as to whether he wasn't taken seriously because he kept hidden or he kept hidden because he wasn't taken seriously. Now, I don't have any siblings in this life. I was raised an only child. I have two older half-sisters, quite a bit older. But for those who have been raised with an older brother, and if that older brother happens to be a star in some way, especially if he happens to be world famous, or at least nationally famous like John Greenleaf Whittier was, you probably understand his situation. The younger brother kind of doesn't dare compete because he knows he's dead in the water before he starts. He'll never be able to compete with his star older brother. And you'll see in the history that Matthew is never mentioned without his brother being brought into the picture. He's always the brother of the poet, the brother of the poet. And his name may not even be mentioned. Occasionally, they would mention him as the author of Ethan Spike after 1857, when his authorship of that series had been exposed to the public. Before that time, he could be mentioned as the brother of the poet, and they don't even say his name. So this is one reason that Matthew kept quiet, because he didn't dare compete with his brother as a literary figure. and he didn't want to ride on his brother's coattails. He had too much pride for that. Early on, I think one reason he didn't come out was because he didn't want to compete with his brother for a different reason. He didn't want to prevail over his brother because his brother was sickly, and he knew that the only way John Greenleaf was going to be able to survive in the world was to become successful as a literary figure. And he actually promoted that, because when he was the unknown editor of the New York Constellation, he would publish John Greenleaf Whittier's works, prose and poetry, to give him a leg up, to give him some exposure in New York. You know, later on, I think he didn't share his work with John Greenleaf, so even John Greenleaf didn't know the kind of work that he was doing. And he really didn't want to be compared to his brother publicly. He didn't want to ride on his brother's coattails, nor did he want to be unfavorably compared to his brother. So these are all the personal psychological reasons why he kept hidden. But we see from this little foray into Matthew's life at the cemetery here that his work was attributed to S.B. Beckett, and Edward Elwell doesn't mention him at all in his book about Portland. So it's kind of an odd scenario that way. Personally, the little bit of hints I get in the literature is that he was close friends with Charles Isley, that he was pretty good friends with Nathan Winslow, and he would, of course, have known and appreciated Abby's older sister. I'm pretty sure that he probably knew Susan Maria, that they probably, when she was a little girl, they may have taken her places and things like that, and had her over for a weekend, or who knows, probably was known to him. So mostly I just did this for fun, but in a particular sense, it was more than fun for me. It did stir up some feelings and some memories. And there's a sense when you visit someone's grave like this that you're visiting the person, whether they're in the astral realm and aware of it or not, I don't know. In a sense, you're visiting a shell. So it's very poignant. Graveyards are very poignant. And one of the things you notice when you go there is that a lot of these stones are fading, and some of them are cracking, some of them have been lost. And graveyards are not permanent either. It just kind of slows the thing down, but nothing's permanent, So these people have gone on to reincarnate, or some of them may still be in the astral realm. They're quite alive, and not a single person whose grave I visited has died, actually. More and more, to me, it's becoming apparent that a body is like a toenail or a fingernail. It's disposable. These things are disposable. I am no more this body, which is talking to you now, than I was when I was Matthew, than I was that body. And I have to say that I feel that I identify more with that face and more with that body subconsciously than I do with this one. So I'm also developing some of the same physical ailments in this body that I had as Matthew around this age. So it's very interesting what the subconscious mind may be doing in that regard. But these things are suits. That's all. They're suits. And however much you may feel, except when you go to the dentist and they give you Novocaine, you may feel that you are this thing. But that experience of having Novocaine is a red flag for those of us who want to identify with our bodies, because suddenly that lip or that cheek or that jaw feels like somebody else's, feels like a thing. Well, it is. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little visit to the cemetery. And very soon I will start sending out those letters to scholars. I've already had an opportunity, an invitation, kind of an automated invitation from Academia EDU to submit a paper. And I submitted a paper having to do with Matthew's authorship of The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free, which was falsely claimed for George Burnham, Matthew's plagiarist, and which librarians have assumed was written by George Burnham. Well, my maximum length was 1,600 words. I maxed it out at exactly 1,600 words in Microsoft Word. I've submitted it, and it now goes to the referees, other scholars, to be reviewed. And this is kind of a test case. I have assumed all along that I would never be able to publish in any scholarly journal because none of the referees would ever sign off on it. And this is a test case. Let's see. Let's see what the reaction is from these people. I'm very curious to find out, how these people review it. They're probably going to want to see a review of the literature, which I didn't do. But with 1,600 words, I barely was able to fit in my own research results. I mean, it would take half of that 1,600 words to try to go back and see what other idiots have said about George Burnham, and Francis Durivage. So I can't do a review of the literature in 1,600 words. Anyway, we'll see what they say, and I will report back.